Imagine this: the golden sands of Egypt, temples rising like mountains carved from stone, and a civilization so advanced that even today we still marvel at its achievements. Ancient Egypt, land of the pharaohs, the pyramids, and the Nile, wasn't just one of the world's greatest civilizations. It was also one of the most rigidly patriarchal. Power was seen as the domain of men, handed from one pharaoh to the next, with priests and nobles making sure the balance of tradition was never disturbed. Now pause for a second. In a world like that, where women were expected to stay in the background caring for families, acting as regents only until a son was old enough to rule it, would it take for a woman not just to hold the throne, but to keep it? What kind of courage, intelligence, and sheer willpower would you need to bend an entire empire's traditions in your favor? This is where our story begins, with a woman who did exactly that. Her name was Hatshepsut. She wasn't just another queen consort, not just a placeholder waiting for the real king to grow up. No, Hatshepsut broke the rules. She declared herself Pharaoh, the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth, and she held on to that power for more than 2 decades. And here's the twist that makes her story so unforgettable. She disguised herself as a man to preserve her throne. She wore the royal headdress strapped on the false beard, was carved into stone with a broad chest and strong arms, so that every subject, every priest, every foreign envoy would look upon her and see not a woman, but a king. Think about how radical that was. In modern times, we still debate the challenges faced by women in leadership. Imagine that struggle thousands of years ago, and the very concept of a female ruler clashed with everything the society believed in. For Hatshepsut, it wasn't just about survival, it was about legitimacy. It's because in Egypt, Pharaoh wasn't just a political title, it was sacred. The Pharaoh wasn't just king, he was a living god. It's at least in the minds of the Egyptians. We're male. So ask yourself, how do you convince an entire nation that you, a woman, have the divine right to rule? Hatshepsut found her answer. You don't just say it to embody it. You transform yourself into the very image people expect to see. And that transformation, that act of disguise, wasn't weakness, it was genius. It allowed her to navigate a system designed to shut her out and instead write her name among the greatest rulers in history. But let's step back for a moment and really picture this. It's around 1479 BCE. The mighty Nile flows through green valleys, surrounded by endless desert. Temples rise on either side, their walls painted with scenes of gods and kings. And within the heart of this civilization, the throne stands empty. A young boy, Thutmose, thrives the rightful heir, but he is far too young to rule. The empire needs strength, vision, and authority. And who steps forward? His stepmother, Hatshep. At first, she rules as regent, safe, traditional, acceptable. But soon, that isn't enough. She sees the danger of being overshadowed, dismissed, or cast aside once the boy grows older. And so she makes her move. It's not just as caretaker of the throne, but as Pharaoh itself. A bold declaration that, against every custom and expectation, would be king. Now here's something worth reflecting on. History is filled with people who played by the rules and were forgotten. But the ones who dared to rewrite the rules, they're the ones we still talk about today. Hatshepsut understood that power isn't just seized, it's performed. It's a story you tell, not just about yourself, but about destiny, about divine will, about what the world is supposed to look like. And if that story required her to put on a beard and a crown meant for men, she didn't hesitate. Some might say she was a pretender, others might say she was an imposter. But I see something different, a strategist, a visionary, a woman who looked at the game laid out before her and decided she wouldn't just play it, she would master it. And isn't that something we can all connect to? Maybe you've been in a situation where you weren't expected to succeed, where the odds were stacked against you, where people saw only what you weren't instead of what you could be. What did you do? Did you back down, or did you find a way, anyway, to prove them wrong? That's the kind of energy Hatshepsut carried into her reign. Her story raises a question that echoes even today. How much of leadership is about who we are, and how much of it is about who we can convince others we are? By the time she was done, Hatshepsut had ruled Egypt longer than many of its most celebrated pharaohs. She presided over years of peace, prosperity, and stunning achievements in art and architecture. But it all started here in this moment of defiance, this choice to step into a role the world insisted was not meant for her. So, as we journey through the story of Hatshepsut, keep this in mind. Behind every monument she built, behind every expedition she launched, was a woman who had to wear a mask just to sit on the throne. And yet, in doing so, she revealed something far greater, not just about Egypt, but about the timeless struggle for recognition, legitimacy, and power. Because sometimes to make history, you don't just break the mold, you disguise yourself as the very thing the world insists you cannot be. When we talk about powerful rulers of the ancient world, we often imagine men, warriors, conquerors, kings, and golden crowns. But behind one of Egypt's most fascinating rulers was a very different beginning. To understand how Hatshepsut claimed the throne, we first need to look at where she came from and the extraordinary twists of fate that shaped her path. Hatshepsut was born into privilege, no doubt about it. She was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife, Queen Amos. That meant she grew up surrounded by the splendor of the royal court, the perfume of lotus blossoms, the chants of priests echoing through the temple halls, the weight of gold jewelry on her young arms. But even in this world of privilege, there were limits placed on her from the start. Not a princess, not a prince. And in ancient Egypt, that difference was everything. The throne wasn't supposed to be hers. Power was expected to pass through the male line. But here's the interesting part. Egyptian royal custom had its own complicated logic. To keep power pure within the royal bloodline, marriages between half-siblings were common. So Hatshepsut married her half-brother, Thutmose II, a man who would become pharaoh. It might sound strange to us today, but to them, this was the way dynasties survived. Now picture this. Hatshepsut isn't just any queen. She's highly educated, trained in religion, politics, and administration. She had watched her father rule and absorbed the lessons of leadership. She wasn't just a decorative presence beside her husband. She was already developing the instincts of a stateswoman. When Thutmose II sat on the throne, she stood beside him not just as a wife, but as a partner in power. But destiny often turns in unexpected ways. Thutmose II's reign was short, and when he died, the future of Egypt fell into a fragile balance. The rightful heir, Thutmose III, was only a boy far too young to handle the enormous responsibilities of ruling the most powerful kingdom on earth. Imagine the tension in that moment, priests, generals, and nobles all looking at each other, wondering who would hold the reins of power until the child king came of age. And this is where Hatshepsut stepped forward. She became regent, ruling on behalf of the boy. On the surface, it was a temporary arrangement, nothing unusual in Egyptian history. Women, usually mothers or stepmothers, had sometimes acted as caretakers of the throne. But Hatshepsut wasn't content to simply babysit the crown. Think about it. She was in her early 20s, intelligent, politically savvy, and already respected. She had connections to the priesthood, knowledge of court politics, and the authority that came from being the daughter of a pharaoh. In other words, she wasn't just holding the throne warm, she was actively shaping Egypt's destiny. Let's pause here and consider what this moment really meant. Hatshepsut could have stayed in the shadows, quietly preparing the boy king for his future role, but she didn't. She began issuing decrees, commissioning building projects, and making decisions. In her own name, slowly but surely, she was testing the waters, expanding her authority beyond that of a simple regent. And here's where the story becomes almost cinematic. Imagine the great halls of Karnak, with priests chanting under the glow of torchlight. Imagine officials gathering, their voices echoing against stone walls as they debated. Should Egypt really be guided by a woman? Could a female regent hold things together in times of uncertainty? Some must have doubted her. Others likely whispered that she was overstepping her role. But Hatshepsut didn't waver. She knew something vital, that power often doesn't wait, politely to be handed over. It has to be seized carefully, strategically, and sometimes in ways that bend the rules. Her father had been Pharaoh. Her husband had been Pharaoh. And now, she was the only one with the strength and vision to guide Egypt. Ask yourself this: how many of us, when placed in a position of temporary authority, would dare to transform it into something permanent? How many would see the chance, take the risk, and change the rules entirely? That's exactly what Hatshepsut did. Her rise to regency wasn't just a matter of family obligation. It was the opening move in one of history's boldest power plays. By stepping in for the child Thutmose III, she positioned herself not only as a caretaker, but as a ruler in her own right. This was the seed of what would later grow into her claim of full kingship, and perhaps the most striking part, she did it all under the watchful eyes of a society that believed women were not meant to wield ultimate power. Yet here she was, proving them wrong not through brute force, but through patience, intelligence, strategic action. So when we look back on Hatshepsut's early years, we don't just see the daughter of a king or the wife of a pharaoh. We see the beginning of a ruler who understood something timeless. Sometimes power doesn't come from waiting your turn, it comes from recognizing the moment history opens a door and daring to walk through it. Imagine ruling a kingdom that never wanted you to rule in the first place. That's the situation Hatshepsut faced. At first, she was just the regent to caretaker for young Thutmose III until he was old enough to wear the crown. Thought the longer she ruled, the more it became clear. Hatshepsut wasn't satisfied with playing the role of temporary guardian. She wanted something far greater. She wanted the throne itself. Now, here's the shocking part. Within only a few years of acting as regent, Hatshepsut did something no woman in Egypt had ever dared to do. She declared herself pharaoh. Not queen regent, not caretaker. Pharaoh, the living god on earth. The ultimate authority in one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Let that sink in for a moment. Ancient Egypt had existed for more than 1,000 years by that point. Hundreds of rulers, dynasties rising and falling. And yet, never before had a woman taken the throne in this way. Hatshepsut was breaking tradition in the boldest way imaginable. She wasn't waiting for permission. She wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. She was rewriting the rules of kingship itself. But here's the challenge. Declaring yourself pharaoh wasn't just a political stunt. In Egypt, Pharaoh wasn't simply a king. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. And Horus, of course, was male. How does a woman convince millions of people, priests, generals, and nobles alike, that she can stand in the place of a male god? Hatshepsut's solution was as brilliant as it was unconventional. She transformed herself at least in image. On temple walls and statues, she is carved not as a woman, but as a man. It's a strong, broad-chested figure, sometimes bare-chested, wearing the false beard of Pharaoh's past. She dressed in male clothing, adopted the royal headdress, and even referred to herself in masculine terms like His Majesty. Pause and think about this for a second. Some people today might see this as denial of her identity, but that's not what this was. This wasn't about who Hatshepsut was inside. It was pure, calculated political strategy. She understood the psychology of her people. Egyptians weren't just looking for a competent leader. They were looking for a god king, a sacred figure who fit their vision of order and tradition. So she gave them exactly that. It's a little like a master chess player making the perfect move. If the board demanded a king, she became the king. The tradition demanded a beard, she wore the beard. She didn't fight the expectations head-on. She outsmarted them, slipping into the role so seamlessly that resistance became almost impossible. And that raises an interesting question for us today. How much of leadership is about reality, and how much of it is about perception? Think about modern politics, CEOs, even celebrities. So much of power isn't just about what you do, it's about what people believe you are. Hatshepsut understood that better than almost anyone. She knew that appearances could cement legitimacy in ways words never could, but imagine what it must have felt like for her personally, every day. Stepping into garments meant for men, ordering statues to portray her with a body that wasn't hers, hearing scribes call her His Majesty instead of Her Majesty. Was it strange? Was it exhausting? Or was it empowering, a daily reminder that she had cracked a system designed to keep her out? Some historians argue that this disguise shows she never fully escaped the gender biases of her time, that she could only rule by pretending to be a man. But I see it differently. To me, it shows her adaptability and brilliance. She didn't just push against the system, she bent it until it worked for her. She used the very rules meant to exclude her as tools for her survival. That isn't weakness. That's genius. Now, think about the people living under her reign. Farmers, artisans, soldiers, ordinary Egyptians who looked up at colossal statues of their pharaoh. Did they care that their ruler had been born a woman? Or did they care more about stability, prosperity, and divine favor? Chances are, most. Egyptians saw the statues, heard the decrees, and thought, here's Pharaoh, here's the living Horus. In other words, the disguise worked. And here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. By embracing this male imagery, Hatshepsut wasn't erasing herself. She was building a legacy. Every carving, every monument, every inscription was a claim that she belonged among the kings of Egypt, as an exception, but as an equal. She wasn't just surviving tradition, she was embedding herself into it. Let's bring this closer to home for a moment. Have you ever had to play the part to be taken seriously? Maybe you dressed differently for a job interview, used different language in a boardroom, or adjusted your style to fit in with a crowd that wasn't ready to accept you as you are. That's not selling out, that strategy. Sometimes, strategy is what allows you to step into spaces that were never built for you in the first place. That's exactly what Hatshepsut did. She played the part until it became reality. She called herself Pharaoh until everyone else did too. And in doing so, she became one of the most remarkable rulers in history. So when we talk about Hatshepsut's disguise, let's not see it as weakness or deception. Let's see it for what it really was, a masterclass in power. She looked at an empire that told her you can't, and she replied, watch me. And the most amazing part, this transformation was only the beginning, because once she secured her throne, Hatshepsut would go on to preside over an era of peace, prosperity, and monumental achievements that rivaled the greatest kings of Egypt. But none of that would have been possible without this bold, risky, and revolutionary choice. To break tradition, to step into a role no woman had dared to claim, and to embody the pharaoh beard, crown, and all. Economic prosperity trade over warmost pharaohs before and after. Hatshepsut are remembered for their military campaigns, conquering new lands, expanding borders, proving their might on the battlefield. But Hatshepsut took a different approach. Instead of sending armies to fight, she sent ships to trade. Her most famous mission was the expedition to Punt, a mysterious land far to the south, possibly in modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. Imagine the scene. Massive Egyptian ships with tall sails, carrying crews across the Red Sea into uncharted waters. This wasn't just a trading trip. It was a grand display of Egyptian ambition and curiosity. When they returned, the ships were loaded with treasures that amazed the entire kingdom. Gold, ivory, exotic animals like baboons, leopard skins, and perhaps most importantly, frankincense and myrrh, sacred resins used in temples and rituals. Egyptians valued these materials as gifts fit for the gods themselves. Think about the impact of that. Instead of draining Egypt's wealth through endless wars, Hatshepsut expanded it through smart, daring trade. She showed that power didn't always have to come from the sword, could also come from open hands and outstretched sails. And isn't that lesson timeless? Even today, nations rise not just through military might, but through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Hatshepsut was ahead of her time, proving that prosperity could be built on peace instead of conquest. Architectural legacy, building for eternity, of course. No pharaoh's reign was complete without monumental building projects. In ancient Egypt, to build in stone was to speak to eternity. And Hatshepsut built like few others before her. Her crowning masterpiece is the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a breathtaking structure carved into cliffs on the west bank of the Nile. If you've ever seen it, you know it doesn't just look like a temple, it looks like a vision. 3 grand terraces rise against the desert cliffs, with rows of elegant columns and ramps leading upward, as if the temple itself were reaching for the heavens. This wasn't just a place for rituals, it was a statement. Every block of stone, every painted wall declared her legitimacy as pharaoh. Visitors walking through its vast courtyards wouldn't just see a queen, they would see a ruler chosen by the gods. But that wasn't her only project. The Karnak Temple, she raised towering obelisks, massive stone pillars pointing straight to the sky. These obelisks weren't just architectural marvels, they were spiritual symbols, connecting earth to the sun god Ra. To carve, transport, and erect an obelisk, some weighing over 300 tons, was an engineering feat so impressive that it still baffles archaeologists today. And here's the part that fascinates me. Many rulers built monuments to glorify themselves. Hatshepsut certainly did that too. But her projects also revitalized Egypt's religious and cultural life. Her temple walls are filled with vibrant images not of bloody battles, but of processions, gods, trade expeditions, and offerings. As if she wanted her reign to be remembered not for destruction, for creation. Stability and peace, a different kind of pharaoh, when you compare Hatshepsut's reign to many other pharaohs. One thing stands out, the peace. She wasn't constantly marching her armies into foreign lands, burning villages, or building her reputation on conquest. Instead, Egypt under Hatshepsut enjoyed stability, wealth, and cultural growth. That doesn't mean she ignored defense. Egypt remained secure under her leadership, but her focus was on consolidation, not expansion. In fact, many historians believe that by avoiding costly wars, she ensured that Egypt's economy thrived, its temples flourished, and its people prospered. Now let's pause here and ask, what makes a ruler truly great? They conquer, or is it how well they improve the lives of their people? By the second measure, Hatshepsut stands among the greatest pharaohs in history. Her reign gave ordinary Egyptians something precious: stability. Farmers knew their crops would be harvested without armies trampling the fields. Traders knew their caravans could travel safely. Artists and craftsmen found steady work decorating temples and carving monuments. Peace gave them space to breathe in, to create. And maybe that's the most revolutionary part of Hatshepsut's story. She proved that leadership doesn't always have to roar, it can also build quietly, steadily, with a vision for the long term. A legacy written in stone when we look at Hatshepsut's achievements. What stands out isn't just her defiance of tradition, it's the fact that she delivered. She didn't just claim the throne, she ruled it well. Through trade, she brought wealth. Through monuments, she left beauty. Through peace, she gave stability. Her reign was a golden chapter in Egyptian history, one that showed the power of creativity and vision over brute force. And yet, perhaps the greatest irony is that many of her achievements were nearly erased after her death. Later rulers tried to chisel away her name, deface her statues, and bury her story. But stone has a way of preserving truth, even when people try to hide it. Today, her temple still stands, her obelisks still pierce the sky, and her legacy still speaks louder than the silence her enemies tried to impose. So the next time someone tells you greatness comes only from aggression, conquest, or domination, remember Hatshepsut? Remember the pharaoh who ruled as a builder, a trader, a peacemaker? The woman who disguised herself as a man not to deceive but to lead, and in doing so, she carved her name into the story of human history. Every story of greatness has its shadow, and for Hatshepsut, that shadow came after her death. Because as much as she built, as much as she achieved, her memory was nearly destroyed, not by time, not by nature, but by human hands. When Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, her stepson, and former coroner, Thutmose III, finally stepped into power as the sole pharaoh. And here's where the story takes a dark turn. Instead of honoring her legacy, Thutmose III launched what can only be described as a campaign of erasure. Stone by stone, image by image, her presence was wiped away. Statues were smashed. Her cartouche, those royal name rings carved into, temple walls were chiseled out, leaving empty scars where her identity once stood. Reliefs that once showed her proudly as pharaoh were hacked apart, her figure replaced with that of other kings or left disfigured. Now let's pause and ask, why? Why would a ruler go to such lengths to destroy the memory of someone who had ruled successfully for 2 decades? Some historians believe it was personal revenge. Maybe Thutmose III resented the years he spent overshadowed, forced to wait while his stepmother held the throne that he believed was rightfully his. Maybe this was his way of finally taking it back, even in death. Others suggest it was political, by erasing Hatshepsut. Thutmose III could strengthen his own legitimacy. He could rewrite the story so that Egypt's throne had passed smoothly, from father to son, with no interruption, by a female pharaoh. That version of history was neat, clean, it's far more palatable to a patriarchal society. And then there's another possibility, one that feels even more chilling. Perhaps Thutmose III wasn't just erasing Hatshepsut for himself, but for the future. By destroying the memory of a woman who had ruled so effectively, he was making sure no other woman would dare to follow in her footsteps. If Hatshepsut's reign were forgotten, the precedent of female kingship would vanish with it, and the throne would remain firmly in the hands of men. Whatever his motives, the results were devastating. For centuries, Hatshepsut's name all but disappeared from Egyptian history. If you were an Egyptian looking back on the line of pharaohs, you might never have known she existed at all. And yet, here's the irony of the attempt. To erase her may have actually preserved her. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began uncovering temples and monuments, they found something puzzling. Signs of destruction, broken statues, chiseled-out names. Beneath layers of alteration, they discovered the hidden traces of a ruler who had once stood proudly as pharaoh. Piece by piece, scholars began to reconstruct the truth. Can you imagine the moment? A dusty excavation site along the Nile, archaeologists brushing away sand from a shattered statue. At first they see only fragments, but then they realize this face, these inscriptions, this template, all belong to a woman, not a queen. Not a regent, but a pharaoh. A woman had ruled Egypt as king. The very act meant to silence her became the evidence that spoke louder than ever. Those scars on temple walls, they became proof of her existence. The gaps in inscriptions, they told a story of deliberate erasure. It was as if history itself refused to let her go quietly. And maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all. You can try to erase a name, destroy a face, rewrite the past, but truth has a way of resurfacing. Hatshepsut's memory was buried for over 3,000 years, but when it returned with force. Today, she's not just remembered, she's celebrated as one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Think about how incredible that is. For millennia, her enemies won. Her statues lay broken, her name forgotten, but time has a way of correcting the record. Today, school children learn her name. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of Egypt's most visited sites. She has books, documentaries, even exhibits in major museums dedicated to her. So what do we take from this? Maybe it's this. Greatness can't always be measured in the moment. Sometimes it's measured in endurance, what survives when others try to bury it. Hatshepsut's story reminds us that while power can erase, time can reveal, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually find its way back into the light. Because here we are, nearly 3,500 years later, still speaking her name, still marveling at her courage, still inspired by her reign. Revenge of all, she outlasted the silence. So what do we really learn from the story of Hatshepsut? Here was a woman who lived in one of the most male-dominated societies the world has ever known. Society that believed power belonged to men, that pharaohs were sons of gods, and that the throne was something a woman could only guard temporarily, never truly claim as her own. And yet Hatshepsut not only claimed it, she ruled it with brilliance. She didn't just survive as pharaoh, she thrived. Her reign gave Egypt prosperity. She brought home wealth through trade instead of endless bloodshed. She left behind monuments, so extraordinary that they still inspire all thousands of years later. And she proved once and for all that the ability to lead has nothing to do with gender. Great leadership is about vision, courage, and the willingness to take risks when the world tells you no. But here's the great irony. For all her achievements, later generations tried to erase her. Statues were smashed, inscriptions defaced, her name scratched off temple walls. Her successor, Thutmose III, made sure her story nearly vanished. Maybe he wanted to strengthen his own legitimacy. Maybe he feared that allowing her memory to live would open the door for other women to claim the throne. Whatever the reason, the attempt to erase her was systematic and deliberate. And yet it failed, because today, Hatshepsut isn't forgotten. She's celebrated as one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands against the cliffs of the Nile, its terraces catching the golden light of the desert sun. Tourists, archaeologists, and historians from all over the world still whisper her name in awe. The very stone meant to immortalize her ended up outlasting every attempt to silence her. Think about that for a moment. How many people in history have had their names erased? How many voices have been silenced, their legacies lost? And yet here is Hatshepsut. Against all odds, her story survived. The more they tried to bury it, the louder it now speaks. Her legacy isn't just about temples and trade missions. It's about the struggles women have always faced in systems designed to keep them out. It's about the extraordinary lengths they've gone to just to be taken seriously, to claim the authority they deserve, to build something that lasts. And maybe that's why Hatshepsut's story feels so modern, even though it's nearly 3,500 years old, because her struggle isn't just locked away in dusty history books, it echoes into our present. We still debate women in power. We still ask whether society is ready for female leaders. We still see women having to work twice as hard, change how they present themselves, or fight stereotypes just to be treated as equals. Sound familiar? Hatshepsut lived that reality at the highest possible level. She played the role the world demanded of her, dressing as a man, calling herself His Majesty, sculpting her image in stone to look like every pharaoh before her. But beneath all that, the truth is clear. She didn't need to pretend to be a man to rule well. Her reign proved she could govern just as effectively, if not more so, than the kings who came before and after. And that's what makes her story so inspiring. She didn't just bend the rules, she rewrote them. She didn't wait for permission, she seized her moment. She didn't let tradition define her limits, she used it as a weapon to legitimize her power. So here's the question. For all of us, what limits do we accept in our own lives? What rules do we obey simply because that's the way it's always been? And what might happen if, like Hatshepsut, we dare to step beyond those limits to claim space in a world that says it doesn't belong to us? Hatshepsut's life gives us an answer. Yes, the obstacles are real. Yes, the resistance can be brutal. But if you have the vision, the courage, and the patience to outsmart the system, you can leave a legacy that even time and silence cannot erase. In the end, Hatshepsut's story is not just about Egypt, it's about the human spirit. It's about defiance, resilience, and the belief that greatness isn't defined by tradition. It's defined by action. And maybe that's why, thousands of years later, we're still telling her story. Because Hatshepsut reminds us that history isn't only written by those who follow the rules, sometimes it's written by those bold enough to break them.